me here. I'm really glad to share my research with you today. It's an honor for me. And I have a presentation, so I don't know if I can share my screen. Pedro, yes? Here we go. Can you see it? Yes? Okay, great. So I'm gonna read my paper. This work is divided into two parts. In the first, I present the problem of underrepresentation of women in the history of philosophy in Mexico and a possible methodological response to solve this problem. In the second, I exemplify the results of this methodology with the case of Laureana Wright, a journalist and feminist of the Mexican 19th century, whose works present philosophical contents that have not been addressed by the history of Mexican philosophy. I will propose that insofar as Wright wrote essays with philosophical content, she should be included in the history of 19th century philosophy in Mexico. In one of her latest contributions on the subject, Sarah Houghton proposes a renaissance regarding the history of women philosophers. The notion of a renaissance, with reference also to the historical period, enables her to characterize the current situation of the studies on women philosophers of the past. According to Houghton, a new renaissance in the history of philosophy is present, despite the fact that we are still facing the oblivion into which most women philosophers have fallen. Based on this, Houghton proposes that in order to understand the current situation regarding the history and philosophical historiography of women, it is helpful to revisit similar periods in the history of philosophy. This history is full of examples of lost philosophy. Many philosophers who are now familiar to us, such as Plato or Plotinus, were lost for centuries and later recovered. As Safre remarks, Plotinus was nothing more than a name during the Middle Ages. In this sense, the humanist project of recovering texts and philosophies of the past can shed light on the recovery of women philosophers. Houghton stresses that the historical contextual approach to philosophy has been crucial to this operation. And I quote, "Historians of philosophy like Karen Green, Ruth Hagenbuber, Jacqueline Broad, and others, myself included, ask what philosophy women produced and how they achieved what they did. Furthermore, this involved not merely focusing on their arguments or what were taken to be their arguments, or assimilating their work to the present. Rather, the approach taken paid attention to the context in which women philosophized and investigated the philosophical and social circumstances in which they philosophized. This approach assumes that to understand the philosophy and arguments of women philosophers of the past, it is essential to reconstruct the context in which they practiced philosophy. Two assumptions of this approach are historical distance and rejection of presentism. This would avoid, according to Houghton, distorting their understanding. Thus, we should examine the philosophy of the past on its own terms. In the aforementioned text, Sarah Houghton revisits the at and steer topic regarding the history of women philosophers. While it is true that prior to this, the general position was that one cannot simply name women philosophers, add them to the standard narrative of the history of philosophy, and mix them in, Houghton's new proposal seems to indicate that the mere act of naming is already an act of recovery, if not history of philosophy yet. And I quote Houghton again. Even if many women philosophers of the past are just names, even if the best we can do is to compile a list of their names, knowing the names of women who philosophize testifies to their existence. It overturns the assumption that women didn't do philosophy, that women didn't have brains enough to do philosophy, or that those who did were exceptional for their sex. Just as the stars in the night sky, whose light died before it reached the viewers on Earth, are key evidence for constructing the history of the universe, So also the names of women philosophers are testimony of the history of female intellectual culture, even if their philosophy is no more. It is commonly said that when restoring women to visibility, you can't just add women and stir. You can just add them in like ingredients in a recipe. Because this does not substantially change anything, but I want to suggest that you can in fact add women and stir. But you have to add enough of them to change the recipe. Few won't make any difference. In what follows, I intend to investigate whether Hutton's strategy might be applied to the history of Mexican philosophy. Referring to a philosopher by name seems more or less evident in the history of philosophy, usually, although not always, organized through a series of reference to male philosophers in a golden chain of names. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, etc. If we ask what a name is, we could turn to onomastics, the discipline that studies names. The name denotes a unique entity at the level of linguistic convention, established to make it psychologically relevant within the level of a basic category. They function as elements to identify someone or something that exists. For example, London identifies an entity within the category city. According to Van Langendonk and Van den Velde, personal names are arguably the most prototypical names. The number and types of names given to people are very specific to culture, as are the principles that guide the shows of a name. From this historical point of view, Katharina Leyring defines each person's name, or the given name, as the name or those names bestowed on an individual person, in most instances a very young child, with the purpose of individualizing this child to separate him or her as a person from other people in vicinity. One of the functions of the personal name is to individualize and include the person in his or her family and social environment. According to studies, first names show the male dominance that characterizes patriarchal societies. In most languages and cultures, there has been a division between semantic content with respect to positive or desired qualities in men as opposed to female names. Words for qualities like strength, power, and bellicosity are most often found in masculine names, while feminine names often contain words that represent beauty and tranquility. Most European naming systems share a division between male and female names. Because man has been regarded as prototypical in all European societies, it follows that many female names have been derived from male names, for example, the Latin Julia from Julius. In addition, historically, fewer women's names are preserved than men's, and most names emanate from people belonging to the upper classes of a society. On the other hand, socionomastic shows that, here we have another quote, the emergence of individual names and name categories is always based on the cultural and social context. In other words, names are not only part of language, they are part of society and culture as well. Names are always born in the interaction between people, the linguistic community, and the environment. People give names to reference they consider worth naming. By giving names, people take control of their environment, leaving their imprint on it, as it were, thus making it part of their own culture. From here, we could go to what it means to erase or forget a name, to exclude an entity from the society or culture to which it belonged would mean to deny its existence. Both Eileen O'Neill and Sabrina Eversmeyer have shown how the oblivion of women philosophers involves the intentional erasure of their names in the histories of philosophy in the second half of the 18th century and during the 19th and 20th centuries. While O'Neill shows how the text of modern women philosophers disappears disappear from for circulation and are forgotten, Eversmeyer focuses on German catalogs or lexicons of intellectually active women whose names, after being recorded in them, are forgotten or erased from the history of 19th century philosophy. I will come back to this later. In this text, I will not discuss O'Neill's approach why publications disappear, but one similar to Eversmeyer's, why even the names of women philosophers disappear. In doing this, my goal will be to study this phenomenon and a method that recovers names and works. This movement is prior to, or should be prior to, the work of the history of philosophy as such. To name is to bring into existence an object that can be subjected to historical and philosophical study. So it's important to study the erasure of the names of people and places, and this study is important in the case of women philosophers because, as Houghton points out, although the work of recovering women philosophers has made important advances, especially for modern women philosophers, we could fall into a new amnesia in which it is forgotten that it is not natural for women to be in this history. And without attention, the project would decline, as seems to have happened with certain feminist efforts in Mexico in the 19th century, as we will see later. A possible method for the study of the erasure of the names of women philosophers and their subsequent recovery is to go back to the past to find where women with philosophical practices were named and to reconstruct the oblivion to which they were subjected through the disappearance of their names. For example, Eversmeyer shows that mentions of women in the history of German philosophy gradually disappeared during the 18th and 19th centuries. It is established that before these centuries and the emergence of the general histories of philosophy, various catalogs and lexicons compile mentions of women philosophers of antiquity and sometimes included some thinkers from more recent times. As the constitution of post-Renaissance national cultures progressed, these catalogs took on more local approaches, compiling names and news about German women. According to Eversmeyer, it is possible to prove that women philosophers were a topic of discussion in Germany before 1800. This discussion contrasts with silence about women in subsequent general histories of philosophy. From this Eversmeyer article concludes that there is a relationship between this exclusion and the women's emancipation movement at the end of the 19th century, which sought to defend their right to university education. For Mexico, we can take as a starting point Fanny Del Rio article, Where Are Women in the History of Philosophy in Mexico? A Case of Epistemic Injustice, original published in French. This text addresses some of the most prominent histories of philosophy in the 20th and 21st centuries in Mexico. Del Rio shows that, I quote, in the 75 years that separate the publication of Historia de la Filosofía en México in 1943 and that of Filosofía en México en el siglo XX by Gustavo Leiva in 2018, two works that can be regarded respectively as the first and the last historical synthesis of Mexican philosophy published to the present day, it can be observed that the number of women philosophers included in the table of contents of each book has remained stationary. 0 in 1943, you can see the numbers here, and 1 in 2018. This is the last book that Del Rio analyzes. So as this table shows, the number of women is really low in all these histories of philosophy in Mexico. And by contrast, the number of men philosophers is very high. So the review analyzes these 18 works written between 1943 and 2018. The reasons for women's exclusion in these histories are interpreted by the Rio within the framework of an epistemic injustice following Miranda Fricker. The misogyny of the founding fathers of Mexican philosophy, according to Del Rio, disqualifies and silences female philosophical practice. For example, José Gauss, an important Spanish philosopher who took refuge in Mexico after the Civil War and is considered one of the leading figures of contemporary Mexican academic philosophy, states. To attempt to explain the historical situation of women and their absence in history because of their weakness is to try to explain the historical fact by the nature or constitution of women, by the incongruity of the personality of women that may be called more briefly femininity, compared with the nature of the sectors of culture and history in which women does not figure. Femininity and philosophy would consist of exactly opposite things. It is not surprising then that woman has not done philosophy because she cannot do it. This is a horrible quote. Del Rio says that Gauss at no time recognizes the omission of philosophical feminism, gender studies, or the fight for women's equality. However, these themes were already current at the time of the first edition of Gauss' book, having been addressed in our country by thinkers such as Paula Gómez Alonso, Rosario Castellanos, and Vera Yamuni. This problem is perhaps more acute if we examine the second half of the 20th century, when it is evident that in Mexico there were a significant number of women who dedicated themselves professionally to philosophy. Only in the Facultad de Filosofía y Letras at UNAM, at my university, the academic staff at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st is made up mostly of women. Maria Garcia Castro, in an article called Women as Subjects and Objects of Study in the History of Social Science in Mexico, provides the following data. In the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters, there are 1,279 teaching staff, of whom 682 or 53% are women. The percentage of women researchers at the Institute of Philological Research was 58% and 59% at the Institute of Historical Research. However, the Institute of Philosophical Research, my institute, reversed the trend with only 23 female researchers out of 59. This fact is not reflected, however, even in the most recent history of philosophy of the Mexican 20th century, written by Gustavo Leiva, as we have seen. Let us look at another example before we try to apply the method. A companion to Latin American philosophy, published by Blackwell in 2010. It is important to bear in mind that these reference works, such as the histories of philosophy in Mexico or the companions in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, are responsible for selecting and therefore recording the names of people they consider valuable enough to be included in the history of philosophy. In this companion, the number of women cited in the onomastic index is 19. These are the women. In the index, you can see we have Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and Laura Benítez. And it should be noted that when we review the content of the chapters in this companion, for example, when talking about philosophy of science in Latin America, other women such as Lourdes Valdivia, Margarita Ponce, and Rachel Laudan are mentioned without appearing in the index. This omission is also important because as a reference work, the fact that the index does not include their names renders their work invisible. As Nathalie Einisch, feminist and member of the French Centre National pour la Recherche Scientifique, shows. She argues that it is the invisibilization of women academics that reproduces gender inequality in university. Einisch runs a database on the invisibilization of women's thought open to women in academia who have seen their work made invisible by the omission of citations, omission in onomastic indexes, among other things. The Blackwell Companion is divided into three sections that seek to give a historical, thematic, and subdisciplinary account of the development of philosophy in Latin America. And it's completed with a biographical section in which 40 people who practice philosophy in Latin America have been selected. Of the 40, we can see their names here. 2 are women, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and Ofelia Chut, one of the editors of the volume. The editors make the goals of this section explicit. They believe that the biographies will be of interest of those who are not familiar with the figures of Latin American philosophy. According to them, a fully biographical chapter can help reduce unfamiliarity with the life and work of philosophers, broadly interpreted to include early philosophical thinkers. An interesting fact for our purposes, the list includes people we don't normally think of as philosophers, such as, let me go back here, Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar was a political leader who led what are currently the countries of Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Panama, and Bolivia to independence from the Spanish Empire. Despite the fact that the companion has broad inclusion criteria that could be used to name women who practice philosophy in Latin America, they are not in fact applied despite the inclusion of a chapter on feminism. The latter, however, has no impact on the biographical chapter, nor do the names of feminist philosophers appear in the onomastic index. The inclusion criteria for this biographical chapter in the companion are: first, for all authors having done remarkable work in some of the main themes, movements, and/or disciplines that make up Latin American philosophy. Second, for authors prior to 1900 to be philosophers or to be non-philosophers, essayists writing on philosophical subjects. And this criterion is going to be important for my argumentation later on. For post-1900 authors to be academic philosophers born before 1950, working in Latin American or to write on philosophical topics related to Latin America. Clearly, this broad criteria of philosophical work in Latin America could have included feminists, essayists, or journalists who deal with philosophical issues in periodicals, such as Laureana Wright herself. And here I will address the second part of my paper regarding to Laureana and her work. A search for the names of women who pursued the practice of philosophy could begin with a return to the biographical models containing catalogs of illustrious women, such as those mentioned by Evers Meyer. On the Mexican side, we find Mujeres Mexicanas Notables, or Remarkable Mexican Women, by Laureana Wright. Little known outside the scope of specialized studies about this feminist and journalist who worked on a series of biographies of women that she published in her weekly newspaper, Violetas de la Náhuac. and were collected posthumously in 1910. A total of 116 Mexican women are organized into four categories distributed as follows: 30 indigenous women, 27 from the colonial period, 17 from the independence, Mexico independent period, and 42 contemporary to Laureana's time. We see how among them, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is one of the few familiar names. Another is that of Carmen Romero Rubio de Díaz, wife of the then president of Mexico, Porfirio Díaz. This naming of women provides a platform to begin researching, just as Gilles Menage's book, History of Women Philosophers, provided a ground first for Mary Ellen White's pioneering work in her also named History of Women Philosophers. The aim of this work, according to Wright, is the following. Here. Faithful to our program, Laureana states, of making all the notable contemporary Mexican women known to our female compatriots, so that they may honor and imitate their glorious example, we find ourselves needing to make use of the right that our nature as chroniclers confers on us. Although in various studies, such as those of Guadalupe Hernández Aquino and Graciela Monjes, she is referred to as a journalist, intellectual, or feminist. Wright's work contains philosophical elements related to the inclusion criteria used in the companion. Her own biography was published in Violetas de la Náhuac on June 10, 1888, written by her colleague Matiana Murguia. Laureana Wright was born on July 4, 1846 in Tasco, a small mining town in southern Mexico, but spent her childhood and adult life in Mexico City. Her mother was Eulalia González, and her father, Santiago Wright, an American mine owner from a well-to-do family who sponsored her education, as she herself narrates in her essay Erroneous Education of Women and Practical Means to Correct It. According to Alvarado, she received a careful private education, basically made up of learning English and French and the first element of illustration. According to Miguel Bolaño, Laureana's contemporary, around 1865, she wrote her first poems marked by her patriotism, a trait that she retains in some of her other published poems. In January 1868, she married Sebastian Kleinhans of Alsatian origin. Bolaño says that she abandoned her literary work for a year to dedicate herself to her husband and home. She had a daughter, Margarita, who also published in Violetas de la Náhuac. She died at the age of 50 in 1896 after a series of illnesses that forced her to abandon the direction of Violetas. Appreciated by the most recognized cultural and literary circles of the 19th century in Mexico, she was a member or honorary member of several societies, such as Netzahualcoyotl, El Porvenir, Liceo Hidalgo, and Liceo Altamirano. This meant recognition as a writer in prose and verse, according to Bolaño. She published her articles in most of the country's newspapers. Her weekly Violetas del Anáhuac, directed by Wright and later by Matiana Murguia, stands out among the publications of the time. According to Bolaño, Laureana is distinguished in her writings by her highly progressive and liberal ideas, by her daring features, and by her philosophical conclusions. Qualities that, if in a man are praiseworthy, in a woman are sufficient title to magnify her. And this is a quote by Bolaño. We have some news about her participation in the literary meetings of Liceo Hidalgo. For example, in 1874, she lectured on Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in one of those meetings. Among the periodicals in which she collaborated, we find El Monitor Republicano, El Bien Público, El Álbum de la Mujer, directed by Concepción Jimeno de Flaquer, another feminist, Violetas de la Náhuac, El Diario del Hogar, and América Literaria. Violetas de la Náhuac was first published in December 1887, but it was not until January 1888 that it appeared under this name. Before, it was titled Las Hijas de la Náhuac. It was a literary newspaper redactado por señoras, written by ladies, whose director was Laureana. According to Alvarado, I quote, despite the short duration of the latter, Violetas de la Náhuac, due to the nature of its contents, it represented an important advance over other publications of the same genre. It was also an excellent means for both its director and most of her collaborators, and even some readers, to express their ideas on various topics, among which educational issues stands out in particular. Thus, through the pages of this weekly, this avant-garde women's group would seek to inform and transform the women of their time. The weekly retained the ambivalent position of its predecessors, always fluctuating between preserving or transforming the female stereotype. Both maintain a much more coherent and progressive editorial line than other publications. And I quote Alvarado again, through its various articles, the weekly questioned the modus vivendi and proposed almost obsessively female education as the only vehicle for the desired transformation. Some of its articles have philosophical content, such as the series on materialism and positivism that ran, here we have an example, from March to April 1888. This impetus for education is in line with two other essays by Laureana. The Emancipation of Women Through Study as one of them, and Erroneous Education of Women and Practical Means of Correcting It. According to Lourdes Alvarado, who edited these essays in 2005, the first appeared in 1891, published by Imprenta Nueva, and the second a year later. On the basis of these essays, according to Alvarado, Laureana can be considered a theoretician of female education. The essays are the first of their kind written by a Mexican, and in them she upholds equality in intellectual capacity between men and women, the ability of women to pursue any profession, and the right of women to practice them. I will confine myself in this last part of my paper to presenting the general structure of the second essay and its relationship to the reception of French social romanticism, especially that of Eugène Pelletan. I will claim that the ambivalent position of Wright is a direct result of the reception of social romanticism theories about women. The essay is divided into 22 chapters in which Wright presents several models of women, like Pelletan in his work The Mother, published in France in 1866 and translated into Spanish in 1875 by Mariano Blanc in Barcelona. In the first chapter, is the table of contents of Laureana's essay. In the first chapter, she recounts the advances that the 19th century has given to women, but establishes that the only way to achieve true equality with men is through education, to which women are entitled, a right that must be enforced. The accusations against women as incapable of enlightenment are due not to their intellectual nature, more or less as Gauss stated later on in the 20th century, but to vices in their education that Wright describes in the following 12 chapters, where she presents a series of short stories which reproduce the ideas set forth by Pelletan in his book. There she presents women as unhappy due to an absent or deficient education. So we find the ignorant, indolent, melancholic, inexperienced, fanatical, indulgent, frivolous woman, as opposed to the enlightened woman, the woman of the home, mujer del hogar, the dignified woman, the wife, the mother, the artist, the scientist woman. This essay closes with 2 chapters dedicated to reading and books, which are key to women's emancipation. According to Wright, I quote, "It is reserved to contemporary women to show that our sex is not, as is commonly believed, incapable of receiving the enlightenment imparted to it, nor is it refractory to advancement, but suffers from an infinity of vices of education, which I shall analyze as far as possible in other chapters, and which are only the offspring of the little cultivation which has hitherto been accorded to their intelligence. Democratic institutions have ostensibly liberated women. In practice, they can only be liberated by the intimate institution of the home. The main cause of women's suffering is ignorance, according to Wright, and there's a distinction between previous generations who were denied even the right to learn to read and write, and that of Laureana, who enjoys relative freedom without sufficient instruction. Within Laureana Wright's conception, the emancipation of women goes hand in hand with their purpose or mission in the society. Regarding this position, it is possible to draw a link with the social romanticism that had appeared in France years earlier. The late 19th century Mexico, in which Wright lived and wrote, was governed by President Porfirio Díaz. This period, known as the Porfiriato, was characterized by a desire to modernize the country. And this led to the importation of European models of progress, such as social romanticism. This is a current that is characterized by considering that equality between the two sexes must be complete. However, this goes hand in hand with the conception of the role of women as redeemers of humanity through their sentimental inclinations. According to Picard, I quote, "Saint-Simon admits women in all jobs, in all dignities. From the women Messiah, the disciples of Saint-Simon hope to obtain the sentimental inspiration that will stimulate their actions." According to Barrault, the whole literary movement of the time had to arrive through revelation and the feeling of a new morality at this glorification of the mother, obsessed by the idea of the mission of women in moral transformation. Pelletan continues with these considerations. He pays a great deal of attention to the destiny of women following the trends of his time. Notable social romanticism, which makes the rehabilitation of women the key to the regeneration of human society. But there is, as Crossley affirms, a contradiction in his position. And I quote Crossley: the message that the mother gives is therefore model and contradictory. On the one hand, Peloton seems to encourage women to emancipate themselves. Oh, woman, however whoever you are, in whatever rank fate has placed you, make your own self. This is a quote by from Peloton. On the other hand, he takes up the old notion of the complementarity between men and women, to each their own sphere of influence. End of quote. While women are equal to men, they are primarily destined to take care of their home and family. Education is necessary to ensure success in these areas, not only for women, but also for their husbands and children, in addition to preserving them from misery in case of being widowed or abandoned by their spouses. In The Melancholic Woman, Laureana returns to that contradiction between nature and education that she seems to inherit from social romanticism. On the one hand, there is no anatomical difference that accounts for distinctions between the capacities of man and woman. On the other hand, Wright states that, I quote, woman more than man has in herself the faculties of subtlety, perseverance, and self-denial, which give her the propensity to carry her passions and feelings to the maximum. That is why we so often see her exceeding in whatever path she follows, and why we cherish the firm hope that the day she is emancipated from the obscurantism and in which she generally vegetates, the day she received a perfect education, she will rise to the summit in everything that is of benefit to humanity. Nevertheless, Wright's endorsement of women's education and the right to work in any profession or craft that she might choose is a revolutionary position for Mexico's 19th century conservative traditions. To conclude, it is worth noting here some parallels with the recovery projects of Latin American women philosophers of the 19th century. For example, as we learned last week with the talks by Pedro and Catarina on María Firmina dos Reis and Josefina Álvarez de Acevedo, we find in them and in Wright a rational exercise that seeks to shape and interpret the world such a way that women should possess the same rights as men, emphasizing that to an identical education. Their philosophical practice is carried out mainly through writing in newspapers and magazines. In Wright's case, her field of concern is clearly national, so she can be considered a precursor of the philosophical reflections on education that would develop during the 20th century in Mexico. Wright presents a series of traditional philosophical contents that should be studied further, such as philosophy of history through a notion of human progress close to the social romanticism of French thinkers such as Peloton, but also linked to feminism. That would earn her a place in the history of philosophy in 19th century Mexico. Further research is required to assess her contribution to feminist Mexican thought and to other intellectual movements such as Spiritism and Freemasonry in which she participated. Thank you very much.